stop whatever you are doing, because what you are about to hear is not a drill, not a simulation, and not the kind of recycled geopolitical commentary that evaporates by morning. Over the past several months, intelligence agencies monitoring North Korean military logistics have detected a series of covert cargo movements, heavily escorted rail convoys moving westward through Chinese territory, unmarked maritime shipments transiting through Central Asian corridors, and a pattern of diplomatic activity between Pyongyang and Tehran so intense and so deliberately concealed that it has triggered the highest classification intelligence alerts in at least 4 Western capitals. The assessments now circulating through the American intelligence community, if they are accurate, describe what may be the most significant covert weapons transfer since the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba in October 1962. According to these assessments, North Korea has transferred, or is in the advanced stages of transferring, approximately 500 Hwasong-18 solid-fueled intercontinental ballistic missile systems to the Islamic Republic of Iran, transported in modular form through a logistics network of staggering complexity, assembled at dispersed facilities across Iranian territory, and positioned in hardened underground silos and mobile launcher configurations that are designed to survive a first strike. If any component of this assessment is accurate, and I want to be clear that these are intelligence assessments, not confirmed facts, then the strategic architecture of the Middle East has not shifted. It has been demolished and rebuilt overnight into something that no existing American or Israeli defense doctrine was designed to address. Now, let me be precise about what we are talking about, because the technical specifications matter, and most people hearing this for the first time will not understand why the Hwasong-18 is different from every other missile system Iran has ever possessed. The Hwasong-18, designated KN-28 by Western intelligence, is North Korea's most advanced intercontinental ballistic missile. It is a 3-stage solid-fueled system with an estimated range of 15,000 kilometers, sufficient to reach any point on the North American continent from a launch site in Iran. Solid fuel is the critical distinction. Iran's existing ballistic missile arsenal, the Shahab series, the Ahmad, the Khorramshahr, are liquid-fueled systems. Liquid-fueled missiles require hours of preparation before launch. They must be fueled at the launch site, a process that is visible to satellite surveillance and that creates a window of vulnerability during which the missile can be destroyed on the ground by a preemptive strike. A solid-fueled missile eliminates that window. It is stored fueled. It is transported fueled. It can be launched within minutes of a command, from a mobile platform that was not at the same location 30 minutes ago and will not be at the same location 30 minutes from now. The shift from liquid fuel to solid fuel is not an incremental improvement. It is a categorical transformation in strategic capability. The difference between a weapon that can be neutralized before launch and a weapon that cannot. 500 of these systems. Let that number settle in your mind before you move on, because the magnitude of what that number represents requires deliberate comprehension. 500 intercontinental range, solid-fueled ballistic missiles, each capable of carrying a payload of approximately 1,500 kilograms, sufficient for a conventional high-explosive warhead capable of leveling a city block, or, if the payload is nuclear, sufficient for a weapon that could erase a city from the map. To a range that encompasses every capital city in Western and Eastern Europe, every American military installation across the Middle East and Central Asia, every Israeli city from Haifa to Eilat, and, if the upper range estimates of 15,000 kilometers prove accurate, the eastern seaboard of the United States itself. Washington, D.C., New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, all within theoretical range of a weapon launched from Iranian territory. The transfer, if it has occurred as the intelligence assessments describe, was executed across an estimated 14-month window through at least 3 separate transit corridors. The first corridor ran through Central Asian rail networks, specifically through routes transiting Kazakhstani and Turkmen territory, using sealed military cargo containers designated as industrial equipment. The second used maritime routes through the Indian Ocean, with transfers occurring at sea between North Korean and Iranian naval vessels in international waters beyond the surveillance range of overhead satellites. The third employed an air bridge using military cargo aircraft operating under civilian flight plans and transponder codes, landing at airfields in western Iran during nighttime windows when satellite coverage gaps made detection difficult. The logistics architecture alone, the coordination between North Korean military production facilities, Chinese transit authorities who either facilitated or deliberately ignored the shipments, Central Asian rail operators, maritime crews, and Iranian reception teams, represents either an intelligence failure of historic proportions if the transfer was completed without Western detection, or an intelligence success of extraordinary sensitivity if the detection occurred, but the interception was judged too provocative to attempt. Either interpretation should deeply concern anyone who believes the existing international system is capable of preventing the spread of weapons of mass destruction. The strategic implications of this transfer are not analogous to any event in the post-Cold War era. They are analogous to exactly one event, and that event nearly destroyed human civilization. On October 16, 1962, President John F. Kennedy was shown aerial photographs taken by a U-2 reconnaissance aircraft over western Cuba. The photographs showed Soviet SS-4 medium-range ballistic missile installations under construction, complete with launch pads, fuel storage, and missile assembly facilities. The missiles, when operational, would be capable of reaching Washington, D.C. in 13 minutes. 13 minutes. That discovery triggered the Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 days during which the United States and the Soviet Union came closer to thermonuclear war than at any point before or since. The world survived, barely, through a combination of restraint, back-channel diplomacy, and sheer luck. That parallel is not rhetorical, it is structural. The Cuban Missile Crisis was dangerous not because of the nuclear warheads themselves. The Soviet Union already possessed thousands of nuclear weapons capable of destroying the United States from launch sites on its own territory. The crisis was dangerous because the missiles in Cuba changed the geometry of deterrence in a way that compressed decision time below the threshold of rational human judgment. Before the Cuban missiles, Soviet warheads launched from Siberia would take approximately 30 minutes to reach the United States, 30 minutes for early warning systems to detect the launch, 30 minutes for intelligence analysts to verify the data, 30 minutes for the president to consult advisors, consider options, and make a decision. 30 minutes is not a long time, but it is long enough for a phone call, a moment of doubt, a hesitation that might prevent the end of civilization. After the Cuban missiles, flight time from Cuba to Washington collapsed to under 5 minutes. 5 minutes eliminated every safeguard that rational decision-making requires. 5 minutes meant that the president would receive the warning and have to decide whether to launch a retaliatory strike before the first Soviet warhead even detonated. No time for verification, no time for communication, no time for the kind of deliberate, agonizing, ultimately life-saving deliberation that Kennedy and Khrushchev managed during those 13 days of crisis. What made the Cuban Missile Crisis existentially dangerous was not the raw destructive power of the weapons. It was the collapse of decision time, the compression of the interval between detection and impact to a duration shorter than the time required for human beings to think clearly under existential pressure. And that is precisely what the introduction of solid-fueled ICBMs into Iran accomplishes in the current strategic environment. Now apply that framework to the current situation and trace the implications with the care they demand, because every implication is a domino, and when the first one falls, the rest follow in a sequence that cannot be reversed. If Iran possesses 500 solid-fueled ICBMs capable of reaching targets at intercontinental range, every component of the American missile defense architecture currently deployed in the Middle East, every single component, becomes strategically inadequate overnight. The Aegis ballistic missile defense systems aboard Arleigh Burke-class destroyers stationed in the Persian Gulf can engage a limited number of ballistic missile targets using SM-3 interceptors. The total magazine capacity of an Aegis destroyer is approximately 96 vertical launch cells, shared between offensive and defensive munitions. Across all Aegis-equipped vessels currently deployed in the Middle East theater, the total number of SM-3 interceptors available at any given time is estimated at fewer than 150. The Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Systems, THAAD batteries, deployed in the UAE and potentially in Saudi Arabia, each carry 48 interceptors. There are an estimated 2 to 3 THAAD batteries in the theater. The Patriot PAC-3 systems positioned across the Gulf states provide point defense against shorter-range threats, but are not designed for ICBM interception. Add every defensive interceptor in the entire theater together, SM-3s, THAAD rounds, Arrow interceptors in Israel, and the total available inventory is somewhere in the range of 300 to 400 rounds. Against 500 incoming ICBMs, launched simultaneously from dispersed locations that were unknown until the moment of ignition, the mathematics are not merely unfavorable. They are catastrophic. Even assuming a perfect interception rate, which no system has ever achieved under combat conditions, which has never even been approached in controlled testing against simultaneous salvos, the defense would exhaust its entire magazine and still have 100 to 200 warheads incoming with nothing left to stop them. The implications for Israel are existential in the literal, not the rhetorical sense of that word. Israel's entire national security doctrine since the 1960s has been constructed on two pillars. The first pillar is regional nuclear monopoly, the undisclosed but universally understood reality that Israel possesses between 80 and 400 nuclear weapons, giving it the ability to destroy any adversary that poses an existential threat. The second pillar is the assumption that American missile defense systems, combined with Israel's own multi-layered defense architecture, Iron Dome, David's Sling, Arrow 2, Arrow 3, provide a protective umbrella that makes any large-scale strategic attack on Israeli territory effectively suicidal for the attacker, because enough incoming warheads would be intercepted to ensure the survival of Israel's retaliatory capability. If Iran now possesses 500 delivery systems capable of reaching any point in Israel in under 12 minutes, from launch sites dispersed across a country the size of Western Europe, both pillars crack simultaneously. The nuclear monopoly becomes irrelevant because Iran now possesses a delivery capability that, regardless of whether the warheads are nuclear or conventional, can saturate Israeli defenses beyond their capacity. And the missile defense pillar collapses because the Arrow 3 system, Israel's most advanced exo-atmospheric interceptor, and the only system in the Israeli arsenal capable of engaging ICBM-class threats outside the atmosphere, has a total estimated inventory of between 100 and 150 interceptors across all deployed batteries. Against 500 incoming ballistic missiles launched in a coordinated salvo from 60 or more mobile platforms whose positions were unknown 5 minutes before launch, the Arrow system would engage the first 100 targets and then have nothing left. The remaining 400 warheads would enter Israeli airspace unopposed. No Israeli prime minister, no Israeli general, no Israeli strategic planner has ever confronted this mathematical reality. And tonight, if these assessments are accurate, they must. Now, here is the part of this analysis that nobody is saying out loud, and it is the part that should fundamentally reframe how you understand this entire situation. The conventional wisdom, the assessment you will hear from every think tank in Washington and every editorial board in the Western press, is that this weapons transfer, if real, represents a catastrophic escalation that makes war more likely, makes the region more dangerous, and makes the world a more unstable place. That assessment is wrong. It is not just incomplete, it is backwards. And here is why. The single most dangerous configuration in strategic history is one in which one side believes it can attack the other with impunity, where the cost-benefit calculation of a first strike appears favorable because the adversary lacks the capability to retaliate in a way that imposes unacceptable costs. That configuration is what existed in the Middle East before this transfer. Israel possessed nuclear weapons. Iran did not. Israel possessed the capability to strike Iran's nuclear infrastructure with relative impunity. Iran's retaliatory options, while painful, were limited to conventional missiles and proxy attacks that, however destructive, did not pose an existential threat to the Israeli state. That asymmetry did not produce stability. It produced the constant temptation of preemptive action, a rolling debate within the Israeli security establishment about whether to strike Iran's nuclear program before it crossed a threshold that would make such a strike too costly. If Iran now possesses 500 ICBMs with the range and payload capacity to devastate any target in the Middle East, that temptation evaporates. Not because Iran becomes benign, but because the cost of attacking Iran becomes so catastrophically high that no rational decision-maker would authorize it. This is not a new concept. This is the foundation of deterrence theory, the insight that peace between nuclear-armed adversaries is maintained not by goodwill, but by the certainty of mutual destruction. The Cold War lasted 44 years without a direct military confrontation between the superpowers, not because the Americans and Soviets liked each other, because both sides understood that any attack would trigger a retaliatory response so devastating that victory would be indistinguishable from defeat. That is what deterrence looks like. It is ugly, it is terrifying, it is morally repugnant, and it has prevented more wars than every peace treaty in history combined. The transfer of 500 ICBMs to Iran, if it has occurred, may have created, paradoxically, counterintuitively, and in a way that will deeply offend people who see the world through a moral lens rather than a structural one, the conditions for a more stable Middle East. Not a safer Middle East, not a more just Middle East, a more stable one. Because stability in strategic theory is not the absence of weapons, it is the presence of consequences so severe that no rational actor is willing to test them. Let me be clear about what this means in concrete, verifiable, testable terms, because abstraction is the enemy of understanding, and tonight is not a night for abstractions. Prediction 1. If this transfer is confirmed by multiple independent intelligence sources, the probability of an Israeli preemptive strike against Iranian nuclear facilities drops from significant, where it has hovered for over a decade, driving endless cycles of brinkmanship and near war, to functionally zero. The risk-reward calculation that has dominated the internal debate within the Israeli security establishment for 15 years, the agonizing question of whether the cost of allowing Iran to achieve full nuclear capability exceeds the cost of a preemptive strike that might delay that capability by a few years, that calculation reverses overnight and completely. The cost of striking first against a country that possesses 500 solid-fueled ICBMs capable of reaching Tel Aviv in 11 minutes is not a diplomatic headache. It is not a regional conflict. It is not a scenario that can be managed or contained. It is national annihilation. No Israeli prime minister, regardless of ideology, regardless of coalition politics, regardless of personal courage, will authorize that gamble. The era of Israeli preemptive action against Iran's strategic programs is over. Not paused, over. Prediction 2. The United States will be forced to fundamentally and permanently restructure its entire military force posture across the Middle East within 12 to 18 months. The current configuration, carrier strike groups operating routinely within Iranian missile range in the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea, major air bases in Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and the UAE positioned within reach of Iranian medium-range systems, an estimated 35,000 American military personnel scattered across the region, serving simultaneously as a deterrent force and a tripwire. This entire configuration was designed for a threat environment in which Iran's strategic strike capability was limited in range, slow to mobilize because of liquid-fueled technology, and vulnerable to preemptive destruction because of known fixed launch locations. Every one of those assumptions has been invalidated. American forces distributed across Gulf state bases are no longer deterrents. They are targets. Their destruction in a retaliatory strike following any American or Israeli action against Iran would produce thousands of American casualties and force the United States into a full-scale war that the American public does not want. The American military cannot sustain logistically over a multi-year period, and the American political system cannot survive electorally. The repositioning of American forces out of Iranian ICBM range, a process that, according to naval tracking data, has already begun, will accelerate dramatically when the intelligence assessments described in this analysis are briefed to congressional leadership. Prediction 3. The global non-proliferation regime, the interlocking system of treaties, inspection protocols, sanctions frameworks, diplomatic pressure mechanisms, and security guarantees designed to prevent the horizontal spread of nuclear-capable delivery systems is finished as a functional constraint on state behavior. Not weakened, not challenged. Finished. The transfer of 500 ICBMs from one sovereign state to another across international borders through third-party territories in direct defiance of every United Nations Security Council resolution, every arms control agreement, and every non-proliferation norm that the international community has constructed over the past 50 years demonstrates conclusively and irreversibly that the enforcement mechanisms of the non-proliferation system are inadequate to prevent determined state actors from sharing their most dangerous military technologies when they perceive a strategic interest in doing so. If North Korea can manufacture, transport, and deliver 500 intercontinental ballistic missiles to Iran without interception or consequence, then every country on Earth that desires a long-range strategic strike capability now has a supplier, a price list, and a logistics template. The proliferation cascade that arms control scholars have warned about for decades is no longer a hypothetical scenario used to justify conference papers. It is an operational reality. And the consequences of that reality, the world in which any state with sufficient financial resources can acquire ICBM capability from a willing seller, will reshape global security arrangements, alliance structures, and nuclear postures for a generation or more. The world that existed before this transfer, if it occurred as described, and I stress that these remain intelligence assessments that must be verified before they are accepted as established fact, that world was built on assumptions that no longer hold and cannot be restored. The assumption that missile defense technology could keep pace with missile offense technology. The assumption that non-proliferation regimes backed by international consensus could prevent state-to-state transfers of strategic weapon systems. The assumption that American military dominance in the Persian Gulf, sustained at a cost of trillions of dollars over 3 decades, was sufficient to deter any adversary from fundamentally challenging the regional strategic order. Those assumptions were the foundation of every security guarantee, every alliance commitment, every defense treaty, and every oil contract that has governed the Middle East since the end of the First Gulf War. The foundation is cracked. And when foundations crack, the structures built upon them do not repair themselves. They do not stabilize. They do not adapt. They settle. They shift. They groan under loads they were never designed to bear, and eventually, inevitably, they fall. The people who will navigate what comes next are not the ones clinging to the old assumptions, hoping the cracks will heal. They are the ones who understood, before tonight, that assumptions are not architecture. They are wishes dressed in confidence. And wishes, in the unforgiving world of strategic reality, have a shelf life measured not in years, but in hours.